What a shame, I lost the first draft of this. Well, back to the drawing board. Specifically, this. So, I have developed a plan to pay off the world's debt. When I say world's debt, I do not mean the entire debt of everyone on this planet. What I mean is the debt of every country on the globe. From North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Australia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. To basically take the world and all its governments. And I have a plan to pay off the world's debt. So, for reference, I don't recommend doing this immediately. First, I recommend doing the US plan for getting rid of taxation. This requires a permanent fund, and if we wait another year or two, putting all the money gained through the permanent fund into the fund itself, then we could generate a surplus. 2 trillion would be my initial estimate. Now, the debt of the world is around $90 to $100 trillion right now. Assuming they somehow manage to keep it at 90 trillion after the US pays off its debt and don't copy our method for getting rid of it, which is entirely possible, then that would leave to 90 trillion in debt to be assumed by one country. Would not recommend this immediately, but using that and assuming a debt interest of 0.5%, then we're looking at roughly $450 billion in interest. So taking that 2 trillion annual surplus, that is $1.55 trillion paid off a year. To put that in perspective, that is higher than the current GDP estimate for Turkey. Granted, it's by the International Monetary Fund, but take the IMF for what it's worth. It's also the highest number I got, so that's our highest comparison, shall I say. So, basically, a Turkey, in terms of GDP, is being paid off every year if these numbers are accurate. And I do believe we could get the interest at 0.5%, especially with such a surplus and such a rapid payment of our own debts. The United States could very easily justify it and convince other lenders that 0.5% for the debt is worth it. I mean, we got the surplus. You think we're not going to pay it off? And look at our record. I mean, 40 trillion at max in debt paid off in 12 years. I mean, freak, that's good. Now, in terms of areas of focus for the US if we adopted this plan, South America due to proximity, North America under the same reasoning, Africa, East Asia, and Southeast Asia are priority focuses. The Middle East is less so because of its sheer instability, so I wouldn't recommend investing there yet until the US can establish firm peace in the region. Unlikely with the current drawing of the map, but remove a few states, build a unified Arab kingdom or something, do something to pacify the Middle East for once, and maybe it can be an important target. But these areas are important for strategic reasons. East Asia is where Mao's rebellion is. Therefore, it's of strategic interest. After all, we want to make sure that competition between that state and its neighbors is fiercely against them. Furthermore, if you're Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, basically any country in that region, and you're and you see this as an opportunity, literally all of your debts being subsumed by the United States, you would jump at the opportunity, especially Japan with how high their debt to GDP ratio is. The Americas, of course, are just sheer proximity, but again, beyond that, not really a priority target. Frankly, they fall into the same category as the Middle East if it weren't for proximity, because to say South America is unstable would be a bit of an understatement. Africa is unstable too, but it's a lot easier to manipulate them, frankly, and a lot of their problems come down to debts and development. If the US were to help lift them out of that situation, stability in Africa could be fairly reasonable. Furthermore, the US is not offering this purely out of its own kind heart. See, in order to justify this, I would like to propose a few things. 1. Control of the budget. The reason for this is fairly simple. If a country is so in debt that they need a bailout, then why should they keep managing the budget, at least for a bit? By taking control of the budget for a few years, the US can effectively help them do the same thing that we did. Simultaneously, it could allow for them to not build any more debt, thus allowing for stable growth and this not getting any bigger, thus making this more meaningful. Second, control over the Constitution. Now, this is a more extreme thing, but the justification is fairly simple. If the governing body is to effectively run itself, then it cannot have a budget or a constitution which allows for such things to happen. Therefore, by taking control of the budget and the constitution, the United States can, in effect, prevent them from going further. And, as should be fairly obvious, it expands the U.S.'s sphere of influence massively. And there's another benefit to the U.S. besides just that. Third is not a demand, but rather a reality. Better trade. If every country which had debts now no longer had to pay that and would instead operate on the U.S. system for how to handle budgets and growth, well, then one, cheaper bureaucracy because you don't have to pay for tax officials, you just have to pay for people to manage the dividends, so that's one thing. Two, it would allow for an ease of the burden on the people and thus greater investments. Civilian investments, and of course just businesses, would naturally spend more, thus increasing consumer spending and investment, resulting in higher GDP, and thus greater trade volume. This allows for an increase in imports and exports, and a growth of U.S. industry as well, since we've done it first, so guess where the money's initially going to go from these people with their new money that they found? Well, they're probably going to spend it in the U.S., or on U.S. goods, and thus the U.S. gets richer. These countries get out of a slump and simultaneously can start developing their own economies to such a point where everyone profits. And by controlling the Constitution and the budget, we can effectively prevent dictatorships or quality of life going below a point where dictatorship or military revolution becomes a perceived necessity. Furthermore, look at the areas I suggested we do this in. You might notice something. Competing with Mao's rebellion, competing with Russia and Mao's rebellion, securing our island, the great island of the Americas. In doing so, we could effectively secure every strategic point that we need to. The Middle East, I'd argue, is a big one as well, but the issue is, of course, the instability. Once the instability is gone, or the U.S. asserts enough control, I would advise including them in the priority targets. So I'll just note that as a 2. Now one may ask, why not Europe or South America? Why not Europe or Australia? One, first world countries, so they have less interest in such a thing, and they already have low interest rates. And two, there's the other factor of simply, they are not relevant, or at least as relevant. Sure, Europe has Russia to contend with, but that's about it. And let's face it, the Middle East does that too with Turkey. Armenia, Georgia, take your pick. Especially the Western Europe, they're not really that big of players anymore. They like to think they are, but they really aren't. The three main players that we see, Mao's rebellion, the United States, and Russia. Europe ain't on that list, and there's a reason. They've stagnated. They're not really that big of players on the board. France tries in Africa, but look at Mali. They can't really do jack. Plain and simply, their empires are gone. It's only right that the U.S. subsume their role, but why go out of your way to do that when there are bigger targets, bigger priorities? Securing our foothold in the Americas to ensure that no one flanks us, and making aggressive pushes in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa to isolate trade partners from the other great powers. The only superpower would see these as priority targets. Europe? It's almost irrelevant, really. But, naturally, with such a plan, there would be benefits for everyone. And eventually I would suggest including Europe because, well, clean the board. Take their empires. In exchange, they get to live in the lap of luxury. I'd say that's a profit. Furthermore, by controlling the Constitution, we can make sure that people are guaranteed every freedom a free man has every right to. It just is profitable. In other words, take the world's debt, assume responsibility for it and the world by extension, and through it, boost trade, boost the life of every person on this planet, boost their wealth, and make everything more efficient. I mean, everyone wins. Now, this debt will take a long time to pay off. I have no question on that. if we were to say ask for the dividends of the permanent funds each country generates to be sent to the US as a way to help pay for the debt, that would be one way to do it. And I would recommend such a thing, but it's not a requirement, nor is it necessarily the best strategy, especially when they're starting to finally get off of taxes, because that makes it a lot harder to do so. But once it reaches that point, let's say after a decade or so, they finally pay off their need for taxes, build enough of a surplus to keep running without it, then yeah, chip away. Theoretically, under this, unfortunate. I could see 40 years, maybe shorter. I doubt we'll be able to do it in 10 years. That's unlikely. 90 trillion in 10 years is very, very slim margins. However, 20? Theoretical. And think about it. 20 years? Imagine going from the most in debt the world's governments have ever been to literally debt-free and no one's even charging tax. I mean, imagine telling your grandkids about that. Oh, yeah, I remember taxes. Those were a thing of the past. Wouldn't that be glorious? I see this as a win. And hey, that's just my thoughts. Have a good one.